Today we're going to build this tall storage cabinet shaped like Gumby, with a hole for a handle. And that's natural. I didn't pokey it in. So while I'm breaking down my sheets of plywood, I guess the first thing to address is why the top of this cabinet is angled. And that's because it's going to go here, not here. So basically the top matches the angle of the ceiling. Okay, now let's talk about how the cabinet's going to come together. The carcass is comprised of 4 pieces. The sides and the bottom are all right angles, and the top slants up at a 20-degree angle. Inside the cabinet, there's 1 fixed shelf that's going to get dadoed in, and then 4 adjustable shelves that you can put wherever you want. And we'll come back to the base and the doors a little bit later. After I was done breaking down my plywood, and by the way, everything's left oversized at this point, I put some hardwood edging onto what will become the fronts of each piece. Then once they were dry, I came back and trimmed everything flush. And in total I had to do 9 pieces, 2 sides each, so 18 pieces of flush trimming, which is a lot, so I did it in fast motion. And it still took me all day and night to finish. The next day I started in on making the miters for joining the carcass pieces. And I'd say that this is probably the most challenging part of this build. Partially because of the angles involved, but also because of the size of the pieces that you're working with. The miters for the bottom joints are pretty straightforward. Just a couple of 45-degree angles to make a 90-degree angle. The top is at an angle that's 20 degrees off of 90, so 70 here and 110 here, depending on how you think of it. So these 2 miters are 35 degrees and 55 degrees. Back in the garage, I set my blade to 35 degrees, and you can ignore the fact that it says 55. It's just referencing the opposite side. And then I could start making my cuts. Sort of. So I ended up having just enough space to make the cut. Actually, to finish it, I had to raise the blade. That's how tight it was. But it worked, so all's well that ends well. Next, I made the complementary cut on the top piece, and this was a lot easier since it's smaller. For the 35-degree cuts, again the length of the side pieces posed a problem. And since these have to be cut normal or flat on the table, the side was just too long, so I decided to cut them both using my track saw instead. At this point, the only cuts that I had left to make were the 45s for the bottom joints, which are going to be a lot easier. So I decided to lay out the whole thing on a piece of plywood and draw it all out to make sure that I got everything to just the right dimension. Basically, you just get to a point in a build where eventually all of the math stops working and you need to just kind of lay things out and cut lines to marks that you make. And I guess this was that point. So finally, with a little back and forth, eventually I got everything dialed in just right. The next thing to do to the carcass pieces was cut them all to their finished widths, and then add in a last bit of joinery, which consisted of a pair of dados in the sides for the fixed shelf, and a rabbet on all 4 pieces for the back panel. Then the last thing I needed to do before assembling was drill out all the holes for my adjustable shelves. And believe it or not, this was actually the first time that I've done this. Well, other than on shop furniture where I didn't really care about being accurate. So I use this jig from Rockler along with a bit that perfectly centers itself in the guide holes and has a stop so that you drill to the perfect depth for the pin, which makes the whole thing go super quick. Basically, you just adjust it to the width of your panel and lock it down, drill your holes, and then use this indexing pin to keep working your way up to ensure that everything's evenly spaced on both sides. Super easy. So I'll throw a link to that, as well as some of the other Rockler tools that I'm using in this video, so that you can check them out for yourself. They make a ton of jigs for a bunch of different applications that really help you save time and make you a more accurate woodworker. So definitely go check them out. Here I'm assembling the carcass, and I'm not sure how I missed one of the shots, but essentially I used these assembly squares along with parallel clamps to get the bottoms attached to the two sides. And these were reinforced with some dominoes, as you saw in a previous shot. But anyway, somehow I didn't get the shot of me attaching the top, which doesn't have any dominoes. It was just clamped on with some band or strap clamps or whatever you call them. After that was dry, I cut my fixed shelf to final size and installed it, which should have been really straightforward, except that I made one really big mistake. Actually, let me back up for a second. So first, to determine the length, I checked my cabinet sides to see how bowed they were, and then I used the length of the shelf to sort of pry them into being flat. Then when I was installing the shelf, I realized that I had forgotten to cut it to its final width. And by this point there was no way I was going to get it out, so I just kept pounding it in until it was flush with the front. And then I used a jigsaw, a pool saw, and some chisels to cut out the extra in the back. So not as clean as it would have been otherwise, but honestly it's fine. Okay, case done. Let's move on to the doors. So when I was drawing things out, I had basic ideas for what I was going to do for the handles, but I had planned to kind of figure that part out last. Then when I was at the lumberyard, I saw this piece of walnut and thought that the hole might make for a cool handle, so I went with it. Here I'm prepping my pieces, and I had to figure out how high I wanted the handle to end up, and then cut the piece to an appropriate place so that I'd get that end result. Then I had to do the same thing in relationship to the edge to make sure that it was the correct distance from the middle. After that, I jointed one edge of each piece, cut them to their approximate width and length, making sure that they're plenty oversized here, and glued them into panels so that I could refine them into the doors later. Oh hey, how's it going? Hang on, let me turn this off. Alright, that's better. Hey, are you liking these videos? If you are, do me a favor and don't subscribe. Well, actually do subscribe, but only so that you can click the notification bell, because apparently that's what's important to YouTube nowadays. Basically, it's just going to let you know whenever I put up a new video so that you don't miss it. So it helps me out, it's free for you, and everybody wins. All right, let's get back to it. Here I'm attaching the doors using some overlay hinges. I started off using 3, and that caused a little trouble, so I tried it with 2 and that was fine. And I don't know what happened, but I can't find the rest of my footage of me fitting the door, and I think it's kind of an important step, so I'm going to explain it with some drawings. I started by cutting out the shape of the doors, but making sure that they were still oversized. Then I mounted them to the cabinet and used the adjustments on the hinges to get them about 98% dialed in, but making sure that they were proud of the exterior of the case. Then I used my router and a flush trim bit to trim the outside perfectly flush with the case. So at this point you're not going to want to adjust those again, and the seam in the center was decent, but not perfect. So I took a compass and drew an equal space gap between the 2 doors, and then took off one of the door and basically sanded to the line. That way when it went back on, the gap was even. So the doors are kind of wonky if you measure things, but if you look at them, they look right, and that's what's more important. The last piece of the cabinet that I had to make was the base. And again in the drawing you can see that I had a few different ideas, but I'm going to be putting this at my parents' house right next to the console that I made them a couple months back, and my mom wanted the bases to be the same, so I went with that. So after I'd milled my pieces, I ripped them into a few 1.5 inch thick and wide strips, and then used my crosscut sled to cut them to rough length. And in this shot here, you can see that I've marked them so that I can end up getting a continuous looking grain when I glue the base pieces together. And I really only paid attention to keeping track of everything for the front section because that's the only part that you're going to be able to see once this thing's in its place. But in any case, next I set the angle of my crosscut sled to 45 degrees and made these little blocks that are going to become the bottom of the legs and then glued them up. And after they were dry, I got out my miter sled and put a 45-degree miter on each corner and then glued those up. So if you've seen even a couple of my videos, you've probably gathered by now that I'm usually pretty rigid when it comes to building things. I go in with a plan, and I've thought about, or at least tried to think about, every little obstacle that's going to come my way during a build. And when it comes to aesthetics, I rarely improvise. So I'd be terrible on one of those design competition shows. And I know this wasn't really anything drastic, but the whole thing, for lack of a better term, was probably about the biggest late in the game design audible that I've ever called. So I guess if I realized anything from this build, it would be this. Having a plan is important, but equally important is a willingness to abandon that plan should something better come along, or when inspiration strikes. In other words, be structured, yet fluid. Bend, but don't break. Be like a stalk of bamboo, or like a lump of clay. Like Gumby. Special thanks to Joe Sassone, or Saccone, I'm not sure how to say it, Andrew Gunther, Bodvin Custom Leather, Alex Fang, Kyle Lyons, Sawyer's Got Wood, Rob Dunham, Eric Kausch, and the rest of my Patreon members for making these videos possible. I don't know if you knew this, but Patreon is actually my single largest source of income. And I can't tell you how much it means to me to have your support each and every month. It's made a huge difference in my life and my family's life. And I just couldn't be more appreciative. So thank you, seriously, for everything. If you want to find out how you can support the show too, check out the Patreon link in the description and see if it's right for you. And as always, no pressure. All right, thanks for watching and see you next time.